Jeremy Craddock, welcome to Crime World. Really nice to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me, Nicola.
And you're going to tell us about your new book, Lady in the Lake, which is a fascinating read and a long road to justice for the lady in question. But start off by giving me a little bit of your own background. Who are you, and why had you come to write this book?
Yes, certainly. So my career, I was a journalist for pretty much a quarter of a century, 25 years in newspapers across the northwest of England, working at a local level, regional and national level. And today I teach the journalists of the future at Manchester Met University.
Right.
But at the start of my career, I worked on the local paper in the Lake District where I grew up. And it was during my time as a reporter there that I covered the case at the heart of the new book, The Lady in the Lake.
So the Lake District is a place we know it's a scenic tourist destination, is it not? Not a place where murders are supposed to occur?
Well, exactly. Cumbria, where the Lake District is a kind of it's a place of two halves, really. You've got the sort of picture postcard, beautiful places, like Grasmere, Windermere, and Ambleside. But you've also got this kind of, particularly on the coast and running up the sort of west coast of Cumbria, you've got very industrial towns actually that have, like Barrow-in-Furness, that have had tough times and working class industrial towns. So it is kind of a sort of a place of two halves, I would say. So murder is something you may.
And what was the beat like there, the journalistic beat? Were you a crime correspondent, or were you covering everything?
I was covering everything, yeah. As you'll know yourself, when you start out, you're a general reporter. So, but crime was certainly part of it, and it would sort of be done in rotation. But I did a fair amount of crime reporting, court reporting, and you would get crimes like this. You get particularly in the sort of touristy areas of Cumbria, you would get the odd crime that would stand out like this. Also quite a lot of passing hotel trade. Lots of itinerant workers passing through. You'd quite often get a lot of crime associated with that kind of industry, I would say. People passing through, yeah.
So when you were working as a journalist, Carol Park is a name from the past. She disappeared in 1976, before your time as a journalist. Did you know of it? Was it a case that would regularly come up? Were there appeals for people to help finding her? Or was it something that was long forgotten?
Yeah, it was. I didn't know the name at all. I was. I grew up in the Lake District. Didn't know anything about Carol Park's disappearance. Probably wouldn't have known about it really, because it didn't get a lot of coverage when she first disappeared. She was from Barrow-in-Furness, so it was covered very briefly by the local paper there, the Northwest Evening Mail, and there was an appeal to find her when she went missing. And that was about it in 76. So in 1997, amateur divers found her body in a package in Coniston Water. And when police were trying to identify who the victim was, the name of Carol Park was one of the ones that kept being suggested by members of the public. But also police, it was one of the main ones that they were looking at for missing persons cases.
So just go back to that for a second. This is 1997, so it's 21 years on. And these are sort of just leisure divers, are they? And they're in one of the lakes?
Yeah, absolutely. They're amateur. There's an amateur scuba diving club in Kendal in the Lake District. And they go into the lakes, they go into Coniston Water and just sort of swim around, but they look for things that maybe have fallen off the back of boats. It's a bit like treasure seeking, really. Things like outboard motors. And I think given the size of this particular package, they probably thought it was some equipment that had fallen off a boat, and they brought it ashore. And obviously, when they eventually cut into through the canvas bag, they realised very quickly that it was a body inside.
Right. And Jeremy, was this canvas package weighted down with something? Was it on the ground of the lake, like as in the bottom of the lake, or was it just sort of, how deep is it basically? How deep is the lake, and was this at the bottom?
It was quite a way out into the lake. So from the shoreline, it was maybe 25 metres into the lake, and then it was down about 15 metres, I think. But it was on a ledge actually. I think if it was a few more metres into the centre of the lake, I don't think anyone would have ever found it. So whoever had deposited it, the luck was against them really, in that it landed on this ledge. But it was weighed down with lead piping, and it was trussed up with ropes and quite sophisticated knots as well.
Right. And this was something that had obviously been brought out to that area of the lake on a boat? There was no way you could have chucked it from the shoreline?
No, it wouldn't. Yeah, it'd obviously been taken out and deposited over the side of the boat, and that was what the police surmised later. Yeah, there was very definitely intent behind it, and whoever had done it didn't want the body to be found.
And one of the central characters in your book, The Lady in the Lake, is Detective Constable Doug Marshall, who's one of the first on the scene that night. He is the guy who pieces together the fact that these remains are those of a 30-year-old mother of 3, Carol Park, who's gone missing in peculiar circumstances 2 decades previous.
Yes. Yeah, Doug is kind of the key detective and a police figure throughout the whole story. And he really, by chance, he was the detective who found himself on the edge of the lake that night in 1997. He was relatively new to CID. He was a detective constable, hadn't really had a huge amount of experience at detective level. But he told me when I interviewed him that he was given the opportunity by his senior officers that he should sort of lead this investigation. I mean, he didn't know in 1997 how long he would be attached to the case, and it would take another, almost a quarter of a century before, the whole case unfolded, and he was still there at the very end. So, yeah, it was very significant for him.
Interesting for us, I suppose, as journalists, Jeremy, but you're the local reporter there, and this is a story while the disappearance back in 76 mightn't have been a big, huge news story. The discovery of the body 21 years later was. So you were joined in your patch by some of the big Fleet Street journalists who were coming in working for the Nationals. They were back in the days when the national papers sent on stories, they sent en masse, and sometimes you found yourself in your patch just literally surrounded.
You do, yes, absolutely. And you're going into that patch normally week after week, and then suddenly you've got as you say, reporters from all over the world actually, and TV and radio reporters as well, and you're suddenly competing to get the story effectively, and there's the competitive edge to it sort of goes up a gear when you've got that sort of competition on.
But the pressure on you as the local guy, because you're the guy who sort of has knows the cops, I suppose, the politicians, the people of the area, and you're expected to be the one to open the door for everybody else.
Yes, although I sort of, when it became apparent that it was Carol Park who was the victim, her being from Barrow-in-Furness, Barrow is kind of outside of the circulation area of the paper I was working for. The connection for us was Coniston Water. So, and I was assigned to go into the patch and cover for the reporter who normally did that patch. So I was kind of finding my feet as I went as well, So it was, it was an interesting time to be covering it.
So what happens next?
So the first thing I did when as I say, it was a new patch for me going straight in. the first thing I did was go and speak to the brother of Carol Park. At that point, the police hadn't confirmed it was her, but it was looking very obvious it was her. I went and spoke to him. He'd obviously lived with the mystery of what had happened to Carol for 21 years. And it was very mixed emotions for him, I think, really. Here was the possibility of perhaps understanding what had happened to his sister, but it was mixed with the awful feeling that, she'd been murdered.
Had they lived in hope that she was just gone missing?
Yes, I think so. The background to it was that Carol had been married to a man called Gordon Park. They'd been together really since their teens in the 60s, been married, had 3 children, but had a very unhappy marriage. She'd left Gordon on quite a few occasions. He was a very controlling man, and there'd been infidelity on both sides. She had found happiness with another man in the northeast of England, but that relationship was put under a lot of pressure because of the being away from her children, not living with her children. That was too much of a wrench for her, and she kept returning to Gordon Park to be with her children, even though she was very unhappy with him.
And the eye of suspicion clearly has to turn to him, isn't it always the husband, especially when there's a unhappy marriage and all the rest of it. No doubt when she went missing, there were certain inquiries made, but without a body, what can be done? But with a body, do the police start looking at Gordon?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In 76, police, I think, were quite suspicious of Gordon Park anyway. But as you said, there was no body. At the time, she went missing at the start of the summer holidays in 1976. She was a school teacher. He didn't report her missing for 6 weeks, so right at the end of the school holidays. And it was only when he went to visit Carol's brother, Ivor Price, and said that she was missing that he actually did report her disappearance. But even then, he didn't tell the police. He told his solicitor, who informed the police. And I think that kind of made the police very suspicious. But there was no body. But yeah, by 1997, the police obviously had their eye on Gordon Park. He was on holiday in France at the time. His son phoned him in France to say, look, there's a body been found.
And the son wouldn't have been her child?
Yeah, the son was,
okay.
So he was Carol's son as well. So they had 3 children. Obviously, Carol had gone missing. And after 7 years, Gordon Park had divorced Carol and had actually been remarried twice since then. But yeah, in 97, his son and Carol's son found Gordon on holiday and said, look, this body, the police think it's Carol. And Gordon Park's reaction was, oh dear, which again, I think wasn't great. Wasn't a great response. And it also took Gordon Park 4 days to get back from France. He didn't rush at all. And again, this just raised the suspicions of the police. And he was arrested as soon as he got back to Barrow. And obviously there was a huge media circus outside his house. Yeah.
Now, he also was a sailor who'd had a boat on that lake at the time.
Yeah. Yes.
And he was a mountaineer who knew how to tie knots.
Absolutely. He was a very keen sailor. He'd sailed on Coniston Water in particular throughout his life. And as you say, he was a keen mountaineer. He was very proficient in tying knots. And at the trial, actually, the rope expert said that the knots that had been used to sort of truss up the body, those knots were way beyond the knowledge of a lay person in terms of understanding knots and ropes. But Gordon Park did have that knowledge, and samples of rope were taken from Park's garage and compared with the knots on the body, and they were sort of comparable knots.
Okay.
Well,
Was there anything forensically left after all those years at the bottom of a lake in a canvas bag that was of use to link Gordon to his wife's murder?
There was very little, actually. There was very little DNA evidence. There was nothing that they could use, to be honest. The evidence that the police ultimately brought against Park was circumstantial. It did after 1997. It took almost another decade before, he was brought to trial. He was arrested in 97 after the body was found, but by early 1998, the charges of murder had been dropped against him because the CPS just didn't feel there was enough evidence. So it was back to the drawing board for the police and for Detective Doug Marshall, actually. Yeah.
And had he continued living locally? Did he, was this shameful for him that the body of his wife had been discovered and that he was arrested, or was he sort of arrogant about it?
He did. Yeah, he did. He continued to live locally. He lived in the Barrow area. He was with his third wife by this time. He was always quite an arrogant person. That Doug Marshall, the detective, said to me when they were interviewing him, he was very arrogant, very cold, and he actually taunted the police quite a lot. It was almost as if to say, why are you being impertinent and asking these questions? I think he was quite a private person. He didn't sort of invite attention locally, but as you can imagine, the gossip and rumour mill was in full force in Barrow at the time. When the charge was dropped against him in 1998, he did an interview with a Sunday newspaper. Was paid £50,000 to sort of talk about his nightmare, as he described it, at being falsely accused, and he sort of urged the police to bring to justice whoever had actually killed Carol Park.
Was obviously feeling very confident, and the £50,000 paid to him is sort of it shows how big the story was in the UK.
It was a huge story. There was, and also around the world as well. I think it had so many elements to it that kind of appeals to, our interest in true crime. And I suppose it had been labelled as the Lady in the Lake. That was the inevitable epithet that was put to it. And it's like classic. It's like something out of Agatha Christie, really. Mm-hmm. So yeah, huge attention and interest.
So Doug Marshall, irritated perhaps by this, who he believes to be a guilty man, looking wistfully across the lake and hoping that the police can solve his wife's then unsolved murder, he just kept at it.
He did. He never gave up on it, Doug Marshall. He told me that he'd obviously spent a lot of time not only with Gordon and Carol Park's children, but with Carol's brother, Ivor Price, and his family. And he felt he just had to keep going to get justice for the family. Obviously, the Cumbria Police's priorities changed and shifted. New crimes emerged. Attention had to be put on those. But Doug didn't want to give up on this case, and he told me that he carried the Carol Park file around with him wherever he went, and whenever he was able to work on it, he would. He was continuing to try and to gather information, and around about the year 2001, he approached his the senior officers and asked whether he could give a presentation to them and to the Crown Prosecution Service to show what he'd done, so that there might be the possibility of rearresting Gordon Park. There was new evidence that was established in those years, which included a couple of alleged confessions that Gordon Park made when he was on remand in 1997. A couple of prisoners who he shared a cell with said that he'd confessed to killing Carol, and he'd sort of said that Carol deserved it. She deserved what she got for for the way she'd behaved in their marriage. There was also evidence that police divers had found a rock in the lake close to where the body had been found, and it was a rock that experts said it shouldn't have been in the lake. It wasn't natural for the lake, and they sort of made tests, and they believed this rock had come from the wall at Gordon Park's home near Barrow-in-Furness. And the other interesting piece of information, evidence really, was a couple came forward who claimed that they'd witnessed Gordon Park pushing the body into the lake in 1976. So this was a young Scottish couple in 76. They just got engaged, and they were on holiday in the Lake District and had gone to Coniston Water for the afternoon. And they were in their car on the shoreline reading newspapers, and they had binoculars, and they were looking across the lake, and there was a boat there, and a man, dark-haired man wearing glasses, and he had a big object. They thought it was a diver's breathing tank, and they watched him push it over the side of the boat. And the woman jokingly said to her partner, "I hope that's not his wife." Something that you might say in jest without really knowing what it was. And it was 20 odd years later, when there was a lot of media attention around this, that the couple recalled this incident and came forward. So that was another piece of evidence that Doug Marshall acquired.
Now, you covered the case. So was it still, even with those extra bits, the statements from him being on remand, the witnesses and the rock, was it still circumstantial though, largely?
Yeah. It was also, there was never one piece, there was never one smoking gun piece of evidence. The whole case, the prosecution case, was built on circumstantial evidence. But when you look at it, and when I'd sort of moved on in my career at this point, so I didn't cover the trial. But when you look at the transcripts and the coverage, it was overwhelmingly pointing towards Gordon Park. And
of course, the circumstantial evidence is sort of really just sort of threads that come together to form a rope.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that was the thing that his defence at the trial really tried to make a big play out of, really. So Doug Marshall, convinced his senior officers and the CPS that Gordon Park should be rearrested, which he was at the start of 2004, and then went to trial at the end of that year and into 2005. But I think Gordon Park, throughout it all, never believed that he would be convicted. He didn't think that the evidence was strong enough, and that was the case that his defence team made as well.
And he died in prison.
He did. He was found guilty, was sentenced to life to serve a minimum of 15 years. He protested his innocence from behind bars, and his family, his children and his wife, sort of launched a campaign to clear his name and get an appeal to overturn the conviction. But he lasted 5 years in prison and then committed suicide in prison.
So was there anything else in his background, Jeremy, or over the time since he murdered his wife? Did he do other things, or was this a one-off, do you think? Well,
yeah, I don't think there's any suggestion that he committed any other murders or anything else criminal, but the pattern of his behaviour and his controlling nature, he was a real disciplinarian, and his children and his nieces described him later as being very controlling. For example, at the dinner table, he would have an egg timer, and if his children didn't eat their vegetables by the time the egg timer had, the sand had gone through the egg timer, he would slam a cane down on the table, and he would be very strict with them. I understand his second marriage was a very unhappy one, and he was very controlling of her as well. I believe when he used to go out and leave her at home, he would he would take the light bulbs out, and he would, just very controlling, things like that. Another very tragic aspect to this story is that Carol Park's sister, Christine, had also been murdered by another man, her boyfriend, in 1969. So Ivor Price, who was their brother, he'd seen both of his sisters murdered in separate incidents.
Both by a partner?
That was by a partner, yes, yeah. And in actual fact, he was convicted and jailed, but he'd been released by the time of Carol Park's disappearance, and apparently was on a home leave to the Barrow area. So Gordon Park's defence team at the trial did try to make something out of this, that it might have been this other man who could have, killed Carol Park. That was something that the prosecutions very much, dismissed.
Well, it's a fascinating story, The Lady in the Lake, a reporter's memoir of a murder by Jeremy Craddock, published by Mirror Books, and it's available in all bookshops and no doubt on Audible.
It's just come out today, actually, on Audible, yes.
Oh, fantastic. And of course, the full story really of that painstaking investigation to try and tie Gordon Parks to the murder of his wife is detailed in the pages of the book, along with your own, I suppose, history with the story. It seems like you become full circle when this book comes out. You're moved on now to lecturing and teaching other young journalists. Has the world changed since you were there reporting on this story? What's their hopes and aspirations for the future, these young journalists?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I do talk about in the book, is how, journalism and reporting has changed. Back then there was no internet, no social media, and people turned very much to their local papers to find out exactly what was going on on their street at the grassroots level. So very much it's changed, and the pace at which we work as well is very different. I think the reporters today are multimedia journalists, and that's what we teach on the course that I work on. But yeah, it was very, very different then. And it's interesting, I think, in the book to sort of compare how we did things then to now,
For sure. But despite the change in the job, I think what lies at the heart of journalism and will do right into the future is, covering a story is still the same, isn't it? It's trying to get down and get all the detail and make your contacts. And
I think the only thing that changes is the equipment and the medium, I suppose. But yeah, essentially the skills are exactly the same. I don't think they've changed in 100 years, really. How do you ask questions? How do you tell a story? They're pretty much immutable, I would say.
And the best ones, of course, have a start, a middle and an end, which this one indeed does. So Jeremy Craddock, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, Nicola.